She was sold like a piece of livestock, her future reduced to the whims of a stranger. The sun beat down on the dusty marketplace, baking the ground until it cracked underfoot. The air hung thick with the stench of sweat, cheap whiskey, and the unspoken desperation that clung to every soul present. Here in the heart of the untamed West, life was a gamble, and some were dealt a hand far crueler than others. Her name, lost to the callous indifference of the auctioneer's chant, was now merely a formality, a sound barely worth the breath it took to utter. She stood, shoulders slumped, eyes cast down, the very embodiment of a broken spirit. Fear, a constant companion, had etched itself onto her face, a mask of humiliation and despair that she could no longer remove. Her story, like so many others, was one of shattered dreams and brutal realities. Perhaps she'd been lured west with promises of a better life, only to find herself ensnared in a web of deceit and exploitation. Or maybe fate, in its cruelest form, had simply dealt her a losing hand, stripping away everything she held dear. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. She was now a commodity, her worth measured in dollars and cents, her fate decided by the highest bidder. The whispers of the crowd, a chorus of callous assessments, reached her ears, each word a fresh wound. She was a thing to be used, a possession to be controlled, her voice silenced, her will broken. But amidst the throng of leering faces and calculating gazes, there was one. A man, standing at the edge of the crowd, his features obscured by the shadow of his hat. He was a stranger, an enigma, a silent observer of the unfolding tragedy. He watched, his eyes reflecting the turmoil within. His heart, hardened by the harsh realities of the West, now wrestled with a conflict he could no longer ignore. He had witnessed the injustices of this world before, had turned a blind eye, convinced that his own survival depended on it. But today, something within him shifted. The sight of this woman, her spirit slowly crumbling before his eyes, ignited a fire he thought long extinguished. He saw not just a victim, but a human being, stripped of her dignity, her future hanging precariously in the balance. The weight of his past, the sins of omission, pressed down on him. He knew in that moment that he could no longer remain a passive bystander. The auctioneer's voice, a relentless drone, continued its descent into the core of the sale, oblivious to the silent battle raging inside the stranger. The auctioneer's voice, a gravelly pronouncement, sliced through the oppressive atmosphere. He rattled off descriptions, each one a dehumanizing assessment of her physical attributes, her potential utility. The crowd, a mixture of opportunists and the simply curious, responded with bids, their faces alight with a grim calculation. The woman remained stoic, her eyes fixed on some distant point, a place where hope might still flicker. The air thrummed with a palpable tension, a suffocating pressure that seemed to tighten with each passing bid. The seller, a man with eyes as cold as flint, delivered his lines with practiced ease, each word a blow to her already fragile spirit. Her internal monologue, a silent scream, echoed in the stranger's mind. "This is how it ends for me. Just another object sold." The weight of these words, the sheer despair they conveyed, resonated deeply within him. He recalled his own past, the moments of moral compromise that had shaped him. He had witnessed cruelty before, but never with such raw intensity. He understood the fear that gripped her, the desperate clinging to a shred of self-respect in the face of utter degradation. The bids escalated. A rancher, his face weathered by the sun, offered a sum. A saloon owner, his eyes gleaming with avarice, countered. The stranger, however, remained motionless, his face an inscrutable mask. The silence that followed each bid was a heavy thing, thick with anticipation and dread. Each increase in price chipped away at her remaining dignity, transforming her into a mere transaction, a statistic in the ruthless calculus of the West. The stranger's emotional turmoil intensified. He wrestled with his own demons, the ghosts of his past, the ingrained habit of self-preservation. "I've stayed silent too long. Not today." This realization struck him like a physical blow, a jolt that propelled him forward. His conscience, long dormant, now roared to life. He could no longer stand by and watch this injustice unfold. He had to act. The auctioneer, sensing the end of the bidding, raised his gavel. The moment of finality was fast approaching. The crowd held its breath, eager to witness the transaction's conclusion. The woman, resigned to her fate, closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. The auctioneer's gavel was poised, a symbol of finality, ready to seal her fate. It was at this pivotal moment, when the silence was almost unbearable, that the stranger finally moved. He stepped forward, his voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the expectant hush. "I bid. More than anyone here can afford to pay," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the assembled crowd, challenging their apathy, their complicity. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, a mixture of surprise and indignation. The seller, momentarily stunned, recovered quickly. A sneer twisted his lips. "You got a name, mister? Or just empty pockets and a big mouth?" The stranger met his gaze, unwavering. "That's not important. What is important is that this woman is not for sale." The crowd murmured again, their reactions a complex tapestry of curiosity, disapproval, and a flicker of something akin to hope. The woman, her eyes widening with disbelief, dared to raise her head, her gaze locking with the stranger's. The confrontation escalated quickly. The seller, fueled by greed and a sense of wounded pride, challenged the stranger's audacity. Words flew like bullets, accusations and threats hanging heavy in the air. "You think you can just walk in here and disrupt a legitimate business?" he snarled. The stranger stood his ground, his posture resolute. "I think I can do what's right," he retorted, his voice resonating with quiet authority. The tension reached a fever pitch. The crowd, sensing the potential for violence, shifted uneasily. Some edged back, seeking to avoid the crossfire. Others, however, remained rooted to the spot, captivated by the unfolding drama, the unexpected act of defiance. The woman, her heart pounding in her chest, watched the stranger, her fate now inextricably linked to his actions. The seller, realizing that he was losing control, lunged forward, intending to physically intimidate the stranger. But the stranger, quicker than anticipated, sidestepped the attack, his movements fluid and precise. The crowd gasped. This was no ordinary confrontation. This was a battle for something far greater than money. It was a test of character, a challenge to the prevailing brutality of the West. Now consider how this applies when you face similar moral crossroads. The stranger's actions, his willingness to risk everything, became a beacon of hope, a symbol of the possibility of redemption in a world consumed by darkness. The stranger's act of defiance, the sheer audacity of his intervention, shattered the rigid order of the marketplace. The seller, momentarily disoriented by this unexpected resistance, sputtered in frustration. However, the initial shock soon gave way to a grudging respect, a recognition of the stranger's unwavering resolve. The crowd, too, experienced a shift in sentiment. The initial hostility, fueled by self-interest and a fear of disruption, began to dissipate, replaced by a growing curiosity and a nascent sense of admiration. Furthermore, the woman herself underwent a profound transformation. The fear that had held her captive, the despair that had threatened to consume her, began to recede, replaced by a hesitant glimmer of hope. Until that moment, she had been reduced to an object, a mere possession to be bought and sold. Now she witnessed an act of genuine kindness, a selfless gesture that challenged the very foundations of her existence. It was as if a dam had burst, unleashing a torrent of suppressed emotions. Building on this, the stranger's actions served as a catalyst, igniting a spark of rebellion within the crowd. The silence, once oppressive, now crackled with unspoken questions and a growing sense of unease. Whispers, initially hesitant, began to circulate, questioning the morality of the situation, the inherent injustice of treating a human being as mere property. The stranger's defiance, it turned out, was contagious, a potent antidote to the pervasive apathy that had characterized the marketplace. Consequently, the dynamics of the situation changed dramatically. The seller, realizing that he had underestimated the stranger's determination and the shifting sentiments of the crowd, found himself on the defensive. His authority, once absolute, was now being challenged, his control slipping away. The auction, once a symbol of his power, had become a stage for his humiliation. This was no longer a simple transaction. It had become a moral contest, a battle between good and evil. Conversely, the stranger, emboldened by the woman's newfound hope and the subtle shift in the crowd's attitude, pressed his advantage. He engaged in a tense verbal exchange with the seller, challenging his motives, exposing the callousness of his actions. His words, sharp and pointed, found their mark, cutting through the veneer of indifference that had previously shielded the participants. He spoke not just for the woman, But for all those who had been victimized by the harsh realities of the West, another crucial layer is the emergence of solidarity. As the confrontation intensified, the crowd began to divide. Some, swayed by the stranger's courage, offered quiet support, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and admiration. Others, still clinging to their self-interest, remained silent, unsure of how to proceed. The woman, no longer alone, felt a surge of strength, a sense of belonging that she had long since abandoned. Now consider how this applies when you witness injustice in your own life. Do you remain silent, or do you find the courage to speak out? The stranger, having secured his purpose, finally stepped forward, his hand extended, not in aggression, but in an offer of sanctuary. The seller, defeated and demoralized, could only watch as the woman, her eyes now alight with a cautious hope, took the stranger's hand. The moment was charged with significance. It was a silent testament to the power of human connection, a rejection of the dehumanizing forces that had sought to define her. He led her away from the scene, away from the judging eyes and the oppressive atmosphere. The marketplace, once a symbol of her despair, now receded into the background, its ugliness fading into insignificance. The journey was undertaken in silence, a shared understanding passing between them. The stranger, his face etched with concern, led her to a place of relative safety, a secluded corner of the town where the weight of the world seemed less pronounced. Consequently, the woman, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, experienced a flicker of peace. The fear that had been her constant companion began to diminish, replaced by a tentative sense of security. The stranger, without uttering a word, conveyed a sense of protection, a promise of safety that she desperately craved. He did not ask her name, nor did he pry into her past. He simply offered her a haven, a moment of respite from the harsh realities of her situation. Furthermore, as they walked, the woman began to observe the stranger. She saw not the imposing figure of a savior, but a man burdened by his own demons, a man who, despite his outward appearance, possessed a profound sense of compassion. She saw in his eyes a reflection of her own pain, a shared understanding that transcended words. Building on this, she began to trust him, not blindly, but with a cautious optimism that had been dormant for far too long. She sensed that this man, this stranger, was different. He possessed a strength not just of body, but of character, a moral compass that guided his actions. She realized that he had not just rescued her from the auction block, he had rescued her from the depths of despair. Conversely, the stranger, in turn, was profoundly affected by her resilience. He had witnessed firsthand the brutality of the world, the callous disregard for human life. Yet, despite her suffering, this woman had retained a spark of hope, a refusal to surrender to the darkness. Her courage, her unwavering spirit, served as an inspiration, a reminder that even in the darkest of times the human spirit could endure. Now, consider how this applies when we witness injustice in our own lives, how the actions of one person can create a ripple effect of change and hope. It is in these moments of courageous resistance that we truly find the strength to overcome adversity. The first rays of dawn painted the sky as the stranger and the woman found themselves away from the clamor of the marketplace. He led her to a modest, unassuming boarding house at the edge of town. It was a place where the cacophony of the West seemed to fade, replaced by a quietude that was both welcome and unsettling. He spoke to the proprietor, a woman with a stern but kind face, securing a room for the woman, ensuring her immediate safety. The transaction was swift, devoid of unnecessary words, a testament to the unspoken understanding that had developed between them. Subsequently, the stranger departed, promising to return. His departure was not a farewell, but a temporary severance, a recognition that she needed time and space to heal. The woman, left alone in the small room, felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Relief mingled with apprehension, hope with a lingering sense of vulnerability. The room, though simple, offered a sanctuary, a physical space that mirrored the emotional haven the stranger had provided. Another crucial layer is the subtle shift in her perception of the world. The marketplace, once a symbol of her impending doom, now seemed like a distant nightmare. The faces of the crowd, once menacing and indifferent, blurred into an indistinct memory. The actions of the stranger, however, remained vivid, etched into her memory like a sacred inscription. His courage had not only saved her life, but had also awakened a dormant part of herself, a sense of agency she thought lost forever. She began to question the assumptions she had carried, the belief that she was merely a pawn in a cruel game of fate. Conversely, the stranger was left with a profound sense of responsibility. He had acted on impulse, driven by a moral imperative that had long been suppressed. Now, however, he understood the implications of his actions. He had not just rescued a woman. He had disrupted the established order, challenging the norms of a society that tolerated exploitation and injustice. He knew that his actions would have consequences, that he had become a target. Building on this, the woman's experience became a turning point in her life. The boarding house room became a space for reflection, a place where she could begin to reconstruct her identity. She started to remember her past, to piece together the fragments of a life that had been brutally disrupted. She thought of her family, her friends, the hopes and dreams that had been shattered. The stranger's actions had given her the opportunity to reconnect with her past and reclaim her future. Furthermore, the stranger's act of defiance became a powerful symbol. His willingness to risk everything, to stand up for what was right, inspired others. It showed that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, it was possible to fight for dignity and justice. This was not merely a rescue, it was a revolution in miniature, a testament to the potential of human kindness. Now consider how this applies when you witness injustice in your own life. Are you willing to be the stranger, to step forward and challenge the status quo? The echoes of the marketplace, once a cacophony of fear and exploitation, now fade, replaced by a quiet reckoning. We've witnessed a transformation, a ripple effect born from a single act of defiance. The initial shockwaves, the clash of wills, have settled, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably altered. The very foundations of power, the silent acceptance of injustice, have been subtly yet profoundly undermined. Drawing these threads together, we see the emergence of a new narrative, one where individual agency triumphs over predetermined fate. The woman's journey, once a descent into despair, has become an ascent, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The stranger's intervention, a spark in the darkness, has ignited a flame, illuminating the hidden corners of the human heart. It highlights the inherent capacity for empathy, the willingness to risk everything for the sake of another. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes clearer. We've observed the corrosive effects of indifference, the devastating power of dehumanization. We've also witnessed the transformative potential of courage, the ability of a single act to reshape reality. It is a story of redemption, not just for the woman, but for all those who have been silenced, marginalized, and forgotten. It is a story of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the possibility of change remains. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the weight of these experiences. It's like a seed planted in barren soil, nurtured by an unexpected rain. The initial act of defiance was a crack in the concrete, allowing for the emergence of something new. The rising tension, the confrontation, served as the sunlight feeding growth. The quiet aftermath, the first moments of sanctuary, became the fertile earth, providing the necessary conditions for flourishing. Reflecting on this journey so far, we are left with a profound question. What is the true measure of a life? Is it defined by material possessions, by social status, or by the impact we have on others? Perhaps the answer lies in the courage to act, to speak out against injustice, to extend a hand to those in need. Perhaps the answer lies in the simple act of choosing humanity over indifference. The story of the woman and the stranger is not merely a tale of the past. It is a living lesson, a constant reminder of our shared responsibility. The echoes of the auctioneer's chant have long faded, yet the resonance of that day persists. We are left not merely with a story of rescue, but with a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature. It is a reminder that the West, a landscape of harsh realities and untamed freedoms, was also a crucible where the best and worst of humanity collided. The stranger's act, seemingly small in the grand scheme of history, becomes a powerful symbol of the potential for change that resides within each of us. The narrative transcends the confines of the marketplace, extending its reach into our own lives. We are challenged to confront the injustices we witness, the silent compromises we make, and the moments when we choose to look away. The woman's journey, from object to individual, from despair to hope, is a testament to the transformative power of human connection. It underscores the importance of empathy, of recognizing the shared humanity that binds us, even in the face of profound adversity. The true measure of this story lies not in the dramatic events themselves, but in the enduring lessons they impart. The stranger's courage illuminates the path toward a more just world, one where dignity is not a commodity to be bought and sold, but a fundamental right. His actions serve as a call to action, a reminder that we all have the capacity to make a difference, to challenge the status quo, and to stand up for what is right. The ripple effects of his decision continue to spread, touching the lives of those who heard the story, and now perhaps even yours. The implications are far-reaching. We are invited to contemplate the nature of freedom, the price of silence, and the profound impact that a single act of kindness can have. The narrative encourages us to examine our own values, to consider the choices we make, and to reflect on the legacy we wish to leave behind. It is a story that transcends time, relevant not only to the era of the Wild West, but to every era, every society, where injustice and inequality persist. The echoes of that day, of the woman's silent plea and the stranger's unwavering resolve, should resonate within us. They should remind us that we are all capable of acting, of speaking out, of choosing to be a force for good in a world that desperately needs it. The true practice begins now, in the choices we make, the actions we take, and the way we treat one another. Let the story of the woman and the stranger serve as a constant inspiration, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope, courage, and redemption are always possible.